Thinking is quite an individual thing, and understandably, there exists individual differences in cognition. The individual differences may come from ability, cognitive styles, and, as we have mentioned, levels of expertise. Cognitive ability may differ in the following dimensions: verbal and expressional skills in terms of understanding words, sentences, and paragraph, and producing different ways of saying the same thing. Problem-solving skills, reasoning skills, that is, drawing logical conclusions from premises. Number facility, which refers to the ability to do arithmetic operations. Induction or finding relations. Memory and recalling. Spontaneous flexibility, which means to produce diverse functions and classifications for an object. Perceptual sensitivity, such as whether one can scan a scene and quickly find something. Visualization, which is to mentally manipulate forms to visualize how they look. And spatial orientation, which refers to mentally fitting pieces into a place. The list goes on. The cognitive ability overlaps with intelligence as reflected by IQ scores on some dimensions, but they're not identical. People differ not only in their abilities, capabilities, and efficiency, but also in terms of their cognitive styles. That is, their habitual and preferred means of approaching cognitive tasks. Personality and motivations influence cognitive style to some extent. For example, some people can easily parse a complex picture and find a particular component in it, and some are not so good at it. This can be tested in a field dependence test. Also, some people enjoy doing thinking tasks, like solving Sudoku or crossword puzzles, and some others do not. This is called need for cognition. Note that field dependence and need for cognition are cognitive styles. They do not necessarily relate to intelligence. Throughout the course, we have mentioned several times that experts and novices deal with cognitive tasks differently, including perceptual sensitivity, representation of information, controlled versus automatic processing, etc. In a famous study, Chase and Simon showed that when chess beginners scanned the board of mid-game configurations for 5 seconds, they could reconstruct the positions of about 5 out of 25 pieces. When chess experts scanned similar mid-game configurations for 5 seconds, they could reconstruct 16 pieces. It is probably that in this task, chunking helps with memory, and experts chunked better because they formed more logical and stable chunks more quickly. Recently, cross-cultural cognitive research has gained popularity. Researchers study how thinking differs among individuals in social groups and with various cultural backgrounds. Social cognition refers to how people make sense of other people and themselves in order to coordinate with their social world. Social cognition can be automatic or controlled. Certain types of judgments are more likely to be automated. For example, threat-related information is processed automatically. Seen in this example, the angry face pops out among other faces. This is because social information may be very complex and people take shortcuts to save time and cognitive resources when dealing with other individuals. For centuries, philosophers and psychologists have been asking the question about self. Mental representations of the self are complex and have many dimensions or aspects. The particular aspect of self influences ongoing cognition and behavior. This is known as the working self-concept. Situational, relational, and cultural factors affect the working self-concept. Situational factors refer to that an individual may have various self-concepts in various situations. For example, a person may have one conception of the self in academic situations as bright, attentive, and interested in learning, and a different concept of the self in social situations as shy and reserved. Respectively, the person thinks and acts differently in a classroom versus at a cocktail party. Relational factors refer to that an individual may have self-concepts with various people or in various social groups. For example, a person is a stringent and serious teacher with his students, but a light-hearted and funny person with his children at home. Finally, the mental representations of self vary depending on one's cultural background. For example, Europeans and Americans emphasize individuality and distinguish oneself from others by using one's unique talents. This is the independent view of self. Comparatively, many East Asian, Southern European, and Latin American cultures see self as part of the encompassing social relationships and adjusting one's behavior according to the perceived thoughts, feelings, and actions of other people in the group. This is the interdependent view of self. Psychologists have constructed questionnaires to measure the degree of independence or interdependence of the self. In sum, the self-concepts certainly affect cognitive processing of information and the corresponding behavioral outputs. Social cultural influences on cognition also occurs in perception, memory, categorization, and reasoning. For example, the effect of Mueller-Lyer illusion is different among observers of different cultural backgrounds. As in, Western observers were more prone to it than indigenous observers from the Torres Straits and southern India. In a memory test conducted in a natural environment, not on the computer, children and adolescents who live in the Australian desert were better at remembering objects and their locations than those who live in modern Australian cities. When people sort and categorize objects, culturally dependent familiarity plays a role. For example, rice farmers from Mano, Liberia could sort rice of different types, but not geometric shapes printed on cards. But American undergraduates could sort shapes, but not different types of rice. Studies have repeatedly found cross-cultural differences in reasoning. For example, Chinese children are more attentive to relationships between objects and would say the cow and the grass are grouped together, as in cows eat grass. American children are more attentive to objects' intrinsic characteristics and would say that the cow and the hen are grouped together because they're both animals. When testing East Asian young adults and European American young adults, all from the same university in the United States, with a reasoning and categorization task, like this one. A Venice on the top left had certain defining features, such as the antenna, a curly tail, and so on. A Saturn on the top right had a different set of features. Participants were supposed to look at a new image and categorize whether it was a Venus or a Saturn. The bottom left is a case where the image to be sorted contained the same features as the model image, but looked different from it. In this case, East Asian students and European American students were equally quick and accurate. However, in the bottom right case, where the image to be categorized did not contain the same features, but looked similar to the model, East Asian students were slower than European American students to categorize it correctly. This is because East Asians used more intuitive strategies of reasoning, and it was difficult for them to ignore the similarity of shape. European American students were accustomed to concentrate on the rules, and the similarity of shape interfered less. This cross-cultural difference in reasoning may be a consequence of a more general and pervasive cultural difference in holistic versus analytic processing of information in East Asia and the West, respectively. Specifically, the East Asian mentality is holistic. When reasoning, East Asians focus on the objects and their context, and ascribe causality by reference to the relationship between the objects and the context. The Western mentality is analytic, focusing attention on the objects, categorizing them by reference to their attributes, and ascribing causality based on rules about them. Much of today's cognitive experiments involve samples of Western population. The implicit assumption has been that the models and theories of cognition developed from such samples are universal, that they may apply to and can describe the performance and behavior of people throughout the world. However, from this class, we can see that this assumption may be problematic because there exist individual differences and cultural differences. Their implications for study of cognition cannot be ignored. We should be cautious in interpreting cognitive abilities, especially cross-culturally. People may have considerably more flexibility in their cognitive processing, and that the ways they approach a task depend on the context, the instructions, and even the stimulus materials. Relatedly, another criticism often raised about exporting traditional laboratory-based experiments to explain how people act in the real world is that if experimental tasks are not closely derived from tasks that people normally engage in during their daily lives, people's performance will not be particularly informative with regard to their real abilities. For example, we probably cannot test a farmer's choice of planting and harvesting methods in a simulated lab task. Researchers must be more careful of this generalizability problem when new technologies such as the VR is used in studying human behaviors. Now we have gone through how cognition occurs within an individual through development and under social-cultural influences. The course begins with the metaphysical genesis of cognitive psychology and the long-lasting ontological and epistemological questions in cognitive psychology. We then go into the detailed modules of perception, attention, memory, reasoning, and so on to see how specific questions are posed, tested, and answered. We then take a step up and situate cognition in a developmental and social-cultural backdrop. We hope all this information has nurtured your interest in studying psychology and can prep you with the fundamentals with which you can form and solve your own questions.